An integral part of the software development process is to build, test, and deliver your code to any destination. In other words, continuous integration and continuous delivery. Continuous integration is a practice used by development teams to merge, build, and test code. It helps to catch bugs early in the development cycle. Automated tests execute as part of CI process to ensure quality. CI produces artifacts and feeds them into the release process for frequent deployments. Continuous delivery is the process in which the code is deployed and tested on one or more test or production environments. Deploying and testing in multiple environments increases quality. Azure Pipelines, which is part of Azure DevOps, provides build and release services to support continuous integration and continuous delivery of your applications. In this video, we'll look into how to set up a build and release pipeline for a web application in just a few steps. So let's get started. Welcome back. Today we'll be looking at how to create build and release pipelines on Azure DevOps using Azure Pipelines. So Azure DevOps comes in two different types. One is the online service, which is called Azure DevOps Services, and then there is a server installation which is called Azure DevOps Server. The one I'm using here is Azure DevOps Service. It's an online service and you can also go and create an account if you don't have one. When you sign up on Azure DevOps, you get a free account with free 5 users basic license, so you can add 4 other users along with you and use Azure DevOps. You get one Microsoft hosted agent. So agents are the services or backend services used by Azure DevOps to build your code and to release to any destination. You also get other features like Azure boards. You have unlimited Git repositories, and you get Azure artifacts, which is like your own NuGet repository, and you have up to 2 GB of space freely available with the free account. So for an individual development, for an individual learning, or for experiments, I think this account is good enough and you can get started with that. So you can sign up with a Microsoft account, or you can use your GitHub account as well to sign up for Azure DevOps. And once you have got your account, you can create a project. You can come to the home page and click here on new project to create a new project. So when you create a new project, you can give a project name and which type of repository you want to use. So you, as I mentioned earlier, you get unlimited private Git repositories. You can choose private, and depending on which kind of process or software development process you want to follow, you can choose the appropriate template. Only thing is that once you select the template, you cannot change it later. So when you're doing it in an organization, then probably think through it, go through the documentation for what each of them means and choose appropriately. So once you have created the project, like I have a project here, you can come to repositories. When you create a project, by default it creates one repository for you, which I have deleted here. I have created my own repository. You can come to this option here on the top, click on the repository name, and it shows all the repositories you have under your project. You can have multiple repositories under your project, and you can click, if you want to create a new repository, you can click new repository type as Git, and you can give a name. If you want to add an .ignore file, you can select whichever appropriate file you want to select. Say suppose you're working on Visual Studio, you can select the Visual Studio option here, and it would create an git ignore file. So if you're not aware of what git ignore file is, it usually when you create a project, you have some files which you don't want to commit, like it could be some user cache files, or it could be debug folders, release folders, some package folders which would be automatically restored during your deployment process or build process. So such folders you don't want to commit, and the git ignore file helps you in ignoring those folders when you are working locally on your repository. Once that is done, you have your repository. Now I have a sample web app project here. That's what we are going to use today to build and release pipelines. So let's have a look at the project. It's a simple .NET MVC project, which has a simple controller and it has some index methods, and let's quickly run it and have a look. So this is the project up and running, and what it does is just displays a list of items on the screen and also pulls out the connection string which is being used. So there is no database being used here, it's just some dummy data which I have put, and it is pulling out that string from the app settings JSON file. Let's go back to Azure DevOps and start building our pipeline. For now, we don't have any pipelines set up for this project, and that's why you see this option on the right top corner, setup build. So now if we click this option, what it does, it takes us to a wizard which helps you create your pipeline. This one is something which is provided very recently in last few years, where it lets you create a YAML file. So that has become kind of a standard these days, where we are writing our pipelines in YAML files. So this interface, it gives you an option to create that YAML file, but for now we will skip this. We'll come back to this later. So now let's click on pipelines on the left menu and click create pipeline. Now, before this YAML interface was introduced in Azure DevOps, there was a classic editor also, which is a UI driven editor. So classic editor is kind of easy, or at least I was more used to it, so I find it easier to get started with. Once you select the classic editor, it will ask you to select a repository. Our repository is .NET Web App. The branch we want to use is main, and let's click continue. Here also it gives you an option to either go with YAML, or you can use some predefined templates, or even use the empty job option, which would just create an empty template for you, and then you can add your tasks. So let's go and select ASP build and test ASP.NET Web Application. So what it would do is by default give you the steps required to build and test your application, or run test on your application. So you have a NuGet installer task, NuGet restore task, then build solution, test assemblies, build simple parts, and publish artifacts. Now each of these items are called tasks. So they are different tasks which are part of your pipeline. Now above these tasks, you have an option called get sources. So this is the same option we did select in the previous page. If you want to change something, we can change here. There are some more advanced options available here, like whether we want to have a clean checkout every time, and report build status, checkout submodules. So there are different advanced options available. So let's skip that for now. Next is agent. So any build process requires a build agent to run on Azure DevOps. So here what we are using is an agent provided by Microsoft itself. Since we are using the online version of Azure DevOps, we have one agent available which we can use, and it lets you run your agent for 30 hours in a month. So it lets you run your agent, or you can use this agent for 30 hours in a month. So if the number of deployments or number of build processes you have consumes lesser than that, you are good with that agent. So let's have a look at each of them. So first one is NuGet installer. So if the NuGet is not available on the agent server, it will install. So what we will do is we will just remove this. We want to use always download the latest matching version, and we'll go to NuGet restore. So what it does is just calls NuGet restore on your solution. So whatever projects are there under your solution, NuGet restore is called for those. Other options we can leave it as is. Next is build solution. It will build your solution using MSBuild. So MSBuild works for both .NET Framework and .NET Core projects, or the new .NET projects. So it works for both. So since our project is on the new .NET platform, it would work for that as well. Then it runs on the test assemblies. So if there are any test assemblies in our project, that would be run. So in our project, we do have a test project and we have few tests defined. So we have around 3 tests defined, which runs unit test on our item service class. And then there are locations mentioned where the test result would be sent. Then we have publish symbols path, so it publishes all PDB files, and then publish artifact. So what this step does, since we have built our solution on build solution step, it picks up those artifacts which are built or the executables and DLLs which were which were the result of the build process. It would pick up those artifacts and it would publish to this directory, that is artifact staging directory. And we can provide an artifact name. We can even override this. We can say unlink and we can provide our own name. And what is the artifact publish location? So for now, we just want to publish it to the Azure pipelines itself. So it would be published on the agent server itself and we'll pick it up from there when we want to release it. We could also use a file share if we want to not use the agent server but want to publish to a different network shared folder. We can use a file share option also. So let's save and quick queue. So in queue, let's select Windows latest agent specification. So in Azure pipelines, the Microsoft hosted agent, we have different agent specifications. So we can define based on which specification we want to run that agent. So we could run it as a Linux agent, we could run it as a Mac OS agent, or even Windows. 2019 is Visual Studio 2019. So if you want to build on .NET 6 and above, then probably you will have to use Windows latest or Windows 2022. Windows 19 doesn't work there. So Windows latest is a safest option to use. So let's click save and run. And with that, we have our build running, and let's go to the agent job, and here we can see the different steps being executed as part of our build pipeline. So let's give it a few seconds to run and complete the build process, and then we'll have a look into it. Now all the steps are executed, and let's go back to this page. So we can see here the project is built and it is ready for deployment. So now let's go and create the same pipeline using .NET commands. The pipeline which we created was using MSBuild. Since it's a .NET the new .NET project or a .NET Core project, we can also use the .NET commands, the .NET build or .NET test, and also use that to create our pipeline. Again, using the classic editor, we can create the same pipeline. We can select the repository and scroll down and select ASP.NET Core, which would create a different set of tasks. It's a similar sequence if you see, but it uses the .NET commands. So it starts again with NuGet restore. So it runs the .NET Core command, and in that it uses the restore command. So .NET restore is what is being used here, and then it would restore any CS project which is available under repository. So this */* means * is any folders and subfolders, and under that, if there is a CS project, it will try to restore it. The next one is build, which would run the build command again on all CS projects. Here the argument passed is build configuration. So here the build configuration is whether to run it as release or debug. So this is an inbuilt variable in Azure pipelines where the value is set to release. Then you have test. So it is running on all CS projects under test folder. So this is like a regular expression or an expression to define which projects to look for, or like a filter which is being used. So any folders which ends with tests will be picked up, and any CS project under that would be built. Again, the build configuration is release. So using this command, it would run the test. Then you have publish, so which is publishing the build project staging directory. Then finally, you have the publish artifact task, which is similar to what we saw in the previous build definition. You have the artifact staging directory and you have the artifact name as drop. So we will not save this, but we will try to create the same set of steps in a YAML file. So let's go back and create a YAML file. So to create using YAML file, again we will use the new pipeline option, and this time we will not use the classic editor, but we will go ahead with this wizard. So let's select Azure Repos Git. So you can see there are other options also available. You can get code from other source code management tools like Bitbucket Cloud, GitHub Enterprise Server, or any other Git repositories which are accessible online over the internet. Since we are using Azure repository itself, let's select this, and it will let you select the repo which you want to use. So we will use this, and let's create a build and test ASP.NET project. So we'll just select the same thing, and we will remove the steps which are here. So if you see here, it again uses the MSBuild option. We want to do it using .NET command. So let's remove this, and let's have a look at what we have here. So the first part is the trigger. This is something which we didn't look in the previous option. So triggers are also available in this classic editor option. When you come to triggers, you can define when you want to trigger this pipeline. So if you enable continuous integration, you can select the specific branch. So any commits to this branch would trigger a pipeline. So the same thing is what is being mentioned here. So for whichever branches you want to trigger, if you don't mention the trigger or you say trigger as none, then every time you have to manually run it. Next is the agent pool VM image. So if you have your own agent, then you have to define the agent name against the pool. Since we are using Microsoft self-hosted agent, so we will specify the VM image as the Windows latest. So if you remember in the build definition, when we were running the build definition, it was giving us an option to select the agent specification, which was like Windows 2019 or Windows latest. That is being defined here as VM image. So whatever was available in that list, that you can use it here also as your VM image. And there's some variables which you can use. So let's keep it that way, and we have to add steps. So in the YAML file, you have to define the steps which you want to perform as part of your pipeline. So you can define stages, you can define steps. So the different ways. So for now, let's keep it simple and just discuss about the task. So we are trying to replicate what was there in the build definition. Pretty much same thing we are trying to replicate here. So for that, to make it easy, let's click on this show assistant and select this .NET Core. So the first command we want to run is restore, and remember we had star.cs project. We didn't have any arguments, and let's keep the rest of the things as same. So let's give it a name as get restore. So this is like providing a custom name to this step. This is optional, but it's good to mention it so that in your logs it gets mentioned clearly that what you are doing in that step. Otherwise everything comes as the name of the step. So this is the first task which we are performing as part of our build pipeline. Next, add the next one, that is build, and path to the project we will put solution. Now why did we put solution? Because that is one of the variables which we have defined here. So since we have this variable in this thing, we can use that. And in arguments, we can use build configuration. Command is build, path is our solution, and let's keep it as it is. My bad, should have put the cursor here. I'll have to do it again. Solution, build configuration. Again, let's put this display here and let's call it build solution. That's our build command. I don't find this YAML editor very intuitive, but that's what we have to deal with. And the next one is test. So here we can do few things. Let me some paths to projects. We'll keep this argument which we want to use is build configuration, and so we want to publish the test results and code coverage as well. And if we look at some details about this, so enabling this option will generate the test results TRX file in agent.temp directory, and the results will be published to the server. Now there is something mentioned for code coverage also. So whenever we are running test, we would also like to know the code coverage, and we can establish rules, decide whether the build is to be passed or failed based on the code coverage. This kind of ensures that whenever new changes are introduced, we are also ensuring that there is proper test coverage for the changes being introduced. For this, we can enable code coverage by calling this option. So let's just copy it and add that as well, and just call add. Again, we will display name, we'll call it run unit test. Okay, build coverage, we'll have test coverage. And now to speed up things, let me just copy rest of the items, and I'll just explain them. So the next steps, as we saw in the build definition in classic editor as well, was publish and publish artifacts. So publish also is being done using the .NET Core CLI command. So the command is publish, and we have set that publish as web project as true, and build configuration is release, and we are sending it to artifact staging directory, and then we are defining the publish build artifact task. So this way all the steps required for a build definition is defined here. Now if you have a look here on the top, it is creating this YAML file under our project itself. So we could also define a path. Let's keep it same. So the benefit of creating a YAML file like this and not using a classic editor is that now the build pipeline is also part of your source code, and you could edit the same pipeline or the properties of the pipeline, the steps of the pipeline in your Visual Studio itself. You don't have to come to Azure DevOps to make those changes, and now it is more customizable and editable, and it becomes part of your source code. So everything is maintained as part of your source code. That is one benefit of using the YAML file instead of using a classic editor, and that's the direction which probably Azure DevOps or Microsoft also is taking, that they are encouraging you to use this approach rather than using the classic editor. Now you can also define your release steps as part of this YAML file, but for now we will use the release option, which is available separately also, and that kind of helps keeping it separate. So let's save and run it. So now when we are saving it, it is committing this file to our repository, and you can directly commit to the main branch, or you can create a new branch and then go through your pull request process. So let's do it. Now if your repository already has build policies implemented, then probably you will not be able to commit it directly to the main branch. And I have a video on the same topic about build policies and how to create those build policies and manage your Git, and you can find the link up here. So go check out that video where you can learn more about how to set up those build policies and manage or streamline your development process on Azure DevOps. So now let's wait for this pipeline to build and finish. Now all the steps are completed. Let's go back to the build, and we can see the tests being run. So there were 3 tests that was run, and all of them have passed, and we can also see the code coverage. So here it is checking the code coverage. Now by default it selects kind of all the DLLs also, other DLLs which are part of XUnit in code coverage. You can exclude them using a run settings file. So we will probably cover it in one of the other videos where we will filter and probably present a more accurate code coverage for this one. So now that our build is ready, let's go and create a release pipeline for this build. Let's go to this release option and create a new pipeline. Now here also similarly, like we saw for build pipelines, there are templates available which you can straight away use based on the scenario you have in hand. But for now, let's click empty job and try to understand the options here. So in a build and release pipeline, the general practice is that you build once and release multiple times. So your build pipeline should always be same. That is, you are building the same set of code and then you are releasing the same set of code or same set of build to different environments. So here you can see stages. By stages, what it means is these environments. You could also use stages to identify different stages in your release process, but also use that way. But generally it is used to identify between different environments. So you would have one stage for dev and then one stage for say non-prod or a pre-prod, and then you have final stage for prod. And generally these are aligned in sequence. So once you deploy your code to dev, you promote the same build to different stages. So to start with, first we'll have to select an artifact which we want to deploy. If you remember, from the previous build definitions, we were publishing those artifacts to staging directory, so that we can select that artifact. So when you're selecting that artifact, it will ask you to select the build pipeline from which you want to select the artifact. So we have two build pipelines. One was which we created using classic editor. Another one is from YAML. So let's select the YAML one, and it has one artifact which it has automatically picked, and it has given an alias to that, and we want to use the latest version which is always available for this build. So let's create add, and now this is the artifact. For your release, you could have multiple artifacts, or you could have multiple build pipelines which converge into the same release pipeline. So if you have more artifacts to be added, you can add more from this add option. So for now we only have one. Let's click on this lightning symbol, and here we can see the option called as continuous deployment trigger. So do we want to release the build as soon as a new build is available? So that is what this option decides. So if you enable it, every time there is a new build, it will trigger the very first stage which is available as part of this release pipeline. So it is always good to add a branch filter here. So what we want is to use main branch. What this would ensure is that if somebody has created a branch from your repository and say you have enabled the build policies, so in that case, whenever a new check-in happens to a branch, that branch is built to check that all checks are being passed, the code is being built properly, and all tests are being passed as per the code coverage. And the resulting build could also trigger this release pipeline, which we wouldn't want, because that build is that code is not merged to your main branch yet, and we wouldn't want to release that code to our environments yet. So these branch filters help that scenario, and it's a good practice to define which branch parameters you want, or which branches you want to allow as part of your build process. So that is done. So now that we have enabled, you can see a blue circle around the symbol, which indicates that continuous deployment is enabled. Then you have the first stage, let's call it dev, so which would identify that it's a dev pipeline. Now we click on this link, that is one job, 0 tasks, means you have this job and you haven't defined any tasks in this stage. So let's click on this, and we come to a similar interface which we saw in the classic editor for build pipelines. Again, we have an agent job here defined, and we can change this to Azure pipelines, and we want to use Windows latest. Now we can add more tasks, or deployment tasks rather. So let's come to deploy and select this app service deploy. So what we are trying to do here is the code we have built, or the web application we have built, we are trying to publish it to an app service on Azure. So let's create this. Here we have some options which we have to set up our pipeline. So the first one is subscriptions. So we have to have a service connection to Azure from Azure DevOps to connect to Azure and deploy the resources. So I already have a service connection here, but you can also click the new button and create a service connection, or you could come to project settings and go to service connection and click a new service connection. You can select Azure Resource Manager, then service principal as automatic, and it will load your subscription. So I have my subscription here, and then it would show the resource groups which are present under this subscription. For example, we are going to use this resource group, which we can select and give a service connection name. So like I have Azure service connection here, we could create a name and save it. So when we do this, what it does is it creates an app registration or a service principal on Azure, through which it is connecting to Azure resources and deploying our services. So let's come back to the pipeline and select the service connection. Once we select, then we have to select the app service type. So the app services which I have created on Azure are of Windows type. So we can keep that intact, or there are other options also available like web apps on Linux, containers. Then we have to select the app service name. Since we have already set up our connection, it is pulling out those names from Azure itself. Since this is our dev stage, we'll select the dev app. So that's the name I have given to my web app on Azure. And this one doesn't have any deployment slots. We are directly deploying to it. Yeah, rest of the items, I think we can keep it intact. Now, before we save this pipeline, we have one more thing to do. That is setting the configuration settings. If you remember, we had a configuration settings in our app settings.json where we were using the connection string. So this is a dummy connection string where I have just defined it as localhost and a local database. In a real-time scenario, you would have a proper connection string. So the idea here is to override this connection string when we are deploying to our dev instance. So for that, what we can do is create variables. So let's add a new variable and call it connection string. And let's come back here, just paste this value, and let's call it dev database and dev server. I'm just putting it just to demonstrate how we can do it. And the scope here we want is not the release. So the scope here means the scope of this variable, whether we want it to be available across the release pipeline or only specific to some stages. So here we can come and select dev. So now this variable, rather this value, is available within the scope of dev stage. We could have the same variable again for our QA database or for our QA instance. So let's call it QAE, and let's come back to dev stage, and we can use this. Now to set the app settings for connection string, we'll have to define it in the app settings. So let's click on these three dots and add the connection string app settings. So we'll have to define it as connection strings : default connection. So since it's a nested property in our app settings, so this is how we define it in the pipeline. For a Windows app, if it's a Linux based app, then instead of colon we have to use a double underscore. And here, now let's put this value in double quotes. Now you don't have to do this every time, but since our value has spaces in between, So we have to mention the variable in double quotes. As you can see here also, it's mentioned in the help note where values containing spaces should be enclosed in double quotes. So now this is done. Let's save and create a release. So now the release is created. Let's come here and wait for the job to complete. So now it's done. Let's come back here and open our app and see if the settings are there. It is loading, it is deployed, and you can see that the connection string. So if you remember, in the code we had local host and local database. Now here it comes as dev server and dev database, which we have defined in the pipeline. So this way you can create multiple stages and deploy it to other environments. So it's very easy to go ahead from here. You can just click add and it creates a new stage. So again, you could either start with an empty job, or an easier way is just to use this clone option. So if you click clone, it creates a copy of dev, and you can come here, you can mention it as QA. The set of tasks are same, or in most cases it is same or pretty much similar. So maybe you could have one or more additional tasks depending on your environment, but yeah, in most cases it is just the same set of tasks being run for different environments. So a clone option is an easier way to extend your stages. And here again you can come and, so in our case we can probably select QAE, and in variables we have a QAE option. Just remove this, and we have already defined a different variable value for QAE, so we just have to change the app service name. Everything would be fine. So this way you can define different stages for each of the environment and deploy the same build to different environments. I'll be covering more complex scenarios in upcoming videos. If you have found this video useful, don't forget to hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Let me know your comments and suggestions in the comment box below. If you want me to cover any specific use case, or you are struggling with a pipeline scenario and need some help, put that out as well. I'll do my best to help you out. If you have been following the microservice series on this channel, the next video will be coming out very soon. I have been tied up with few things at work, but yeah, we'll get that out soon. Thanks for staying till the end. That's all in this video. You can find something interesting to watch next here. See you there. Adios.